Howdy, my name is Frances Jackson. Pronouns are they, them. I am the coordinator of the LGBTQ+ Pride Center in the offices of the Dean of Student Life here at Texas A&M University. I'd like to start off by thanking Anise Parker, LGBTQ Victory Fund and Victory Institute President and CEO, and 61st Mayor of Houston, Texas, for taking the time to come talk to us about LGBTQ women's history. We'll start off with a little bit of Mayor Parker's bio. I'm going to give a really brief historical context for LGBTQ folks, and then we'll have some questions. And last, if we have some time, we'll take some audience questions. You can submit your questions over Facebook Live, or if you're with us here in Zoom webinar, you can type them in the Q&A chat function, and we will do our best to get to those. All right, so briefly, LGBTQ Fund Victory and Victory Institute President and CEO Anise Parker is the first former elected official to lead the organizations, having served 6 years as Houston City Council member, 6 years as City Controller, and 6 years as Mayor of the city. She is one of only 2 women to have been elected to mayor and is the only person in Houston's history to have held all 3 offices: council member, controller, and mayor. She's the first openly LGBTQ mayor of a major American city. Mayor Parker graduated from Rice University with a bachelor's degree in arts. In the private sector, she spent 20 years working in the oil and gas industry and was also the co-owner of Inklings, a lesbian feminist bookstore, for 10 years. We'll get into a little bit more about her history when we dive into those questions. So I want to frame this context in some American history for everyone. So we're going to dive into that with just some quick points really quick. So in 1984, Gay Student Services versus Texas A&M University is a court case in which the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals held First Amendment required public universities to recognize student organizations aimed at gay students. In June of 2003, Lawrence versus Texas was a landmark decision in the United States that ruled that laws prohibiting private homosexual activity, sodomy, and oral sex between 2 consenting adults as unconstitutional. Don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue was a military policy banning troops from openly serving in the U.S. military from 1994 to 2011. The Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, defined marriage for federal purposes as between a man and a woman. That ruling was challenged, and that rule or law was challenged and overturned with the United States versus Windsor in 2013, and then with Hogfeld versus Oberfeld versus Hodges in 2015. I apologize there. And then most recently in 2020, we had the Equal Opportunity Commission rule that there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that the Civil Rights Title 1964 protects LGBTQ folks, allowing them to work without employment discrimination. So that is a really quick turnaround of events for folks. And so hopefully we'll be able to dive into some of these questions, and Mayor Parker can color us a little bit more of, I think, what was going on in her role in some of these things. So with that, Mayor Parker, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, happy to be with you tonight. I've had a number of occasions to engage with students at Texas A&M, and including during my time at Rice when I was on the women's softball team and we got shellacked every time we played Texas A&M. But I have better, more fond memories in more recent years. So I'm a native Houstonian. I actually still live in Houston. I'm at my home in Houston now. Spent my early adulthood in the oil and gas industry, which was 80% of the Houston economy when I graduated from college. Did own the Inklings Lesbian Feminist Bookstore for 10 years. Sold that bookstore with my partner when I was elected to city council. I was elected to city council in 1997. Served 3 terms, 6 years, term limited. Elected city controller, served 3 terms, 6 years, term limited. Elected mayor, served 3 terms, 6 years, term limited. I would have been happy to spend more time in either one of those positions, but I absolutely believe that being mayor of my hometown is the best political job I could possibly ever have. And I wish I'd had an opportunity to continue to serve. I'm now banned for life for all those positions. We have lifetime term limits, so I can't go back. But in terms of LGBT history in the state of Texas, I'm not quite old enough for Stonewall. I have a Wikipedia page, which you can visit, but I'm 64 years old, about to turn 65, so I'm not quite old enough for Stonewall. I was in college in the mid 70s, but the first LGBT organizing event I attended was in 1975. I was actually, I think I was a sophomore student at Rice at the time, and I had decided when I came out when I was in high school, but really, other than my girlfriend, didn't tell anybody. So when I came to Rice in the fall of 1974, I decided I was going to be out on campus. Wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. It was it's the one way to make yourself a sort of a pariah in a woman's dorm environment, but I did it. And fortunately for me, I, over time, connected to the broader lesbian feminist community of Houston. And several older lesbian feminists took me as a project, I guess. I was sort of the mascot for a group that was very politically active and engaged, which is how I ended up at the Texas Gay Conference in 1975. So there was definitely a movement in Texas early on, and I'm gonna sound not very articulate here because I hadn't been thinking about it this way, but first organizing in 1975. I'm also one of the founding members of the Rice University LGBTQ student group. I think it's called Rice Pride now. It's changed its name a few times, but in 79, it was the year after I graduated, but in 79, it was the Rice University Gay and Lesbian Student Support Group. And it was important to have the G and the L words there. University of Houston had an LGBT student group. I believe University of Texas had an LGBT student group, and Rice. I don't know that there were others in the state very early on. So but between Texas Gay Conference and that time, and then later I served as president of the Houston Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. I was the co-chair of Lesbian Gay Democrats of Texas, co-chair of Lesbian Gay Rights Lobby of Texas, which is now Equality Texas, and an officer or board member of probably a dozen LGBT organizations. I have been a part of the arc of LGBT history in Houston. The biggest difference now and then is the amount of engagement and communication we can do horizontally. Being an organizer in the 70s was very isolating. We were all on our little islands trying to find each other. There was no social media. There were no cell phones. There was no internet. That you heard of an activity through a friend of a friend. And y'all don't know what a mimeograph is, but mimeograph pieces of paper that we shared. Mailing lists were blackmail tools, and you guarded them with your life, but they were the only way you could connect to each other. And effectively, we had to reinvent the wheel everywhere we were, because there was very little, that horizontal engagement with other LGBT groups trying to do the same things we were. I spent probably the first 10 years after I graduated from college being Miss Gay Everything while I was working in the oil industry. Spent the next 10 years, I got a little burned out on being Miss Gay Everything, and threw myself into civic association activism. So working on housing issues, working on neighborhood protection issues, and at some point decided that the best place to work on the things I was passionate about, LGBTQ rights and neighborhood issues, was on the Houston City Council. So that launched my political career. So 20 years in the oil industry, 18 years full-time public life. I've been out of office now 5 years, and have come full circle. I run the LGBTQ Victory Fund and Victory Institute. It's a 30-year-old Washington-based political organization that is, we're in identity politics. Our mission is to make sure that LGBTQ leaders are in appointed office and in elective office across the United States. Every state, every level. We don't do policy, we don't do lobbying, we do people. And we work to change the lives of the LGBTQ community by helping people enter the political process. So that's a kind of rambling but short version of why I'm talking to you tonight, how I got here.
Awesome, thank you. So you talked a little bit about that early piece of the 70s and stuff. I know this wasn't something being pre-scripted, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, did you ever get involved in AIDS organizing in the 80s? I think we talk about AIDS and we think so much about New York and San Francisco, but I'd really like to just hear a little bit about Texas during that time.
Absolutely. And in fact, Rice University in Houston has an AIDS oral history project for which I've been interviewed, and a number of folks have. So if anybody's deeply interested in, delving into sort of AIDS activism in Texas, that would be a place to go. But Houston is and was a big international city. I mean, the reason that AIDS was spreading so fast in New York and San Francisco and LA were the same reasons that it very quickly began to spread in Houston, in that big international city, lots of travel. Apparently, the person who first brought AIDS into the United States was a flight attendant. And so the reasons that AIDS might grow or spread rapidly were present in Houston. I was very active in what was the Houston Gay Political Caucus, which became, it's the alphabet soup, which became the Houston Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus while I was president, which became the Houston Gay and Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Political Caucus. And I'm not actually sure what the name of it is now, but it is still there. But I was the second woman president of that organization I have cats. Sorry about that.
In the 1980s. The Zoom pets here at the LGBTQ plus Pride Center. Hold with us, folks.
The first woman president of the Houston LGBT Political Caucus was Sue Lovell, who became a council member in Houston, the second openly LGBT elected official in Houston. She preceded me as caucus president. I preceded her in local office, but her brother died of AIDS. And the organization itself was very involved in organizing and activism, but Houston had chapters of ACT UP and Queer Nation. And of course, ACT UP was specifically focused on drawing attention to the AIDS crisis. There were protests and die-ins, not to the level you would see in some of the other cities we mentioned, but a very active and vibrant community nonetheless. It's as someone who's been an activist in Houston for decades, we do have, I mean, we have protests, but we very seldom have riots. It's just a different, I don't know, it's a mindset or something about the culture, but we can go out and block an intersection. We don't have to set fire to a building to do it. And, you know, so some of the activism that happened in Houston might not have gotten the headlines that it did in other places, but there was a very vibrant community. I remember the first person, I'd known several folks who died of AIDS, and in 1986, I was 30 years old, and I was invited to provide remarks at the memorial service for someone who died of AIDS. And I didn't realize it. I looked down, and his birthday was 2 days from mine. We were almost exactly the same age. And I was horrified thinking about, you know, how young I was, and that someone, you know, that I was too young to know someone who died. And unfortunately, I ended up knowing more and more and more and more men who died.
Thank you for sharing that. I know the AIDS epidemic can be emotional and just so many things there. So I really appreciate you diving in with us. So before we got on Facebook Live, Mayor Parker actually talked a little bit about the Lawrence case with me. And so I thought maybe you could give us a little bit of context and tell us about your role in that, because, you know, it's something that gets a little overshadowed these days with, you know, marriage equality and obviously equality to work, some really big landmark decisions that we're very excited about. But, you know, we have to go back to those early cases and stuff where we get to start that work. And so if you could, you know, give us some context, tell us about your role, that would be amazing.
Happy to. Folks who want to do more research should look up the Lawrence v. Texas case. I guess the Obergefell, which brought us equal marriage, is really about our striving as activists, as a community, to achieve something that was denied us. The work in Lawrence v. Texas, and prior to that, Bowers v. Hardwick, was about trying to protect ourselves from direct discrimination. That a lot of the activism is, you know, there's two faces of it, and one is that we are, and actually as a community still are, actively discriminated against in many places and in many ways. And the one of the added problems of living in Texas is the fact that we had a sodomy statute that made private consensual sex. They really didn't think much about women, but private consensual sex between two men was a violation of the Texas sodomy statute. There's that was section 2106 of the state penal code. There was, I think 2107 was you couldn't have sex in public without being arrested. 2106 was you couldn't have sex in private either. Now, the problem with doing away with that statute is we had to have a case to challenge it because the legislature wouldn't do anything about it. And so I can see, you know, someone's thinking, well, you know, someone having sex in the privacy of their home, you know, no harm, no foul. Why is it a big deal? If you are a known homosexual, you are a presumptive criminal in the eyes of the state of Texas. And there were any number of licenses that could be, and certifications that could be denied you on the basis of being in violation of a felony statute in the state of Texas. And so it wasn't that hordes of people were being dragged out of their bedrooms, it was that this statute was used to discriminate against people and to prevent people from access to making a living. The City of Houston Police Department actively weeded out cadets who were LGBT on the polygraph, as they were going through their background check, asking about sexual conduct. And if you were honest, if you lied and they caught you, you were rejected. And if you were honest and saying, yes, I'm gay, well, then you were a presumptive felon and you couldn't become a police officer. So there were real consequences of 2106. But in order to overturn it, we had to have a case to litigate. And it wasn't happening. It wasn't about public sex. It was about in someone's bedroom. And I had been a council member for not quite a year, September of, I think, 98. And I was in my office one night and I got a call from a fellow activist. I helped originate, and for 5 years, I taught a class on elements of the LGBT community, how to police the LGBT community to the Houston Police Department. 91 through 95, something like that. So I am very familiar with police procedures, very familiar with the police department. The person who took over teaching my class at the police department was actually the person who called me, and he said, Anise, you're not going to believe this, but we have the perfect test case to do away with the sodomy statute in Texas. And the best part is that it's in a JP court. The JP wants to work with us, and we can make this happen. All we have to do is convince the two guys who were arrested not to plead guilty and just go home. If they had pled guilty, they could have they got a slap on the wrist, like a $50 fine, and they'd be gone. We had to convince them to plead not guilty. So Lane Lewis and I and the late activist Ray Hill started making phone calls, and Lane Lewis said, we've got to find them a lawyer really fast. And I suggested local attorney Mitchell Katine. I said, he's a real estate lawyer. He doesn't do this, but you will not have to explain to him the importance of this case, and he will find the other lawyers that we need. So we lived in Mitchell Katine. But the interesting thing happened. This is John Lawrence, and you can read about it, and you can do an internet search. But he was entertaining two gentlemen who were a friend of his and someone he had picked up, Tyrone Garner, in his home. One of his longtime friend, I can't remember the name of the friend, apparently got jealous that John was flirting with Tyrone, and he stormed out, and he went around the corner, and he went to a payphone, and he called the cops and said that there was again, this may sound familiar, a black man with a gun, a threatening black man with a gun. So Harris County Sheriff's deputies came roaring up. He pointed out the apartment where the scary black man with a gun was threatening people. They went up to the apartment. The police let themselves in and found John and Tyrone Gardner engaged in some form of sexual act and arrested them. So we had the first part, someone who was actually arrested for violating Section 2106 of the Penal Code, ended up in the Justice of the Peace Court of a JP by the name of Mike Parrott, who, an ally to the LGBTQ community, had been endorsed by the political organization, political caucus previously, really nice guy. But the most important part is he had a court coordinator who was familiar, a straight ally, who was familiar with 2106, and she started the ball rolling. made the phone calls, got the activists involved, and we were able to persuade John and Tyrone to not plead guilty and go home, but to plead innocent. And one of the funniest things was the judge is like going along with this. He doesn't really want to. He doesn't want to keep them in jail. He wants to turn them loose. So he gives them a really low fine. And the lawyers have to go back and say, Judge, you need to fine them more, because if you don't, there's a threshold so that we can appeal it. And we can't appeal it if you don't slap them with a big enough fine. So the judge had to go back and give them a bigger fine. So just the stars aligned, that we had plaintiffs who would be willing to be involved in this, and then someone who recognized the importance of the case. And of course, it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Lawrence v. Texas, the ruling came down that there ought to be some places and some things that are truly private, and the state has no role in that private adult consensual sex. And while I had only a tiny piece of it, it's nice to be in the right place and be able to make history help history happen.
That's such an incredible story. I really want to encourage our folks looking at home to both look up the case, but also look up statutes currently, because there are still US laws on the books for sodomy laws, which I think is something people don't necessarily think about, is that there.
Actually, I think 2106 is still on the books in Texas. I don't think it's been done away with. It's just not enforceable.
Oh.
So,
Plot twist.
something to take care of. I actually, there is actually a court case. If you do an internet search for Pigeon v. Parker, I have my name on a court case. I think it's actually been restyled Pigeon v. Turner, because the current Mayor Turner has taken it over. But I was, while I was mayor and had authority over city HR department and policies, after the Windsor decision, which recognized marriage in those states where there was legal marriage, and recognized marriages from other states, full faith and credit. I made the decision that city employees who had married in other states should be treated as legal spouses and receive spousal benefits in the city of Houston. I think there were 6 couples. There may have been 8. I think there were 6 couples out of 22,000 city employees who registered that they were legally married couples, and we gave them their benefits. I was promptly sued by a couple of right-wing activists, Pigeon being one, for, in their view, violating the state's prohibition on recognition of LGBT marriage. And then I was promptly sued by friends of mine from Lambda Legal and on the left, because they wanted standing in the case. And so all I did was stand up and do the right thing, and then become a piñata for a while from the two sides working it out. That is still unresolved completely. But the scary thing about it is that the state Supreme Court, I guess it's the state Supreme Court, was not going to, it went to an appellate court. The state Supreme Court didn't want to hear it. Dan Patrick, Greg Abbott, all of the senior right-wing Republican officials in the state of Texas weighed in with our 100% Republican elected state Supreme Court and said, you really need to look at this case. It shouldn't just be about, it's not, because our position was, once Obergefell came, it was all moot anyway, because everybody had legal rights. But it's scary, because the assertion by Dan Patrick and others is that marriage may be required by the Supreme Court, but benefits are not inherent to marriage. and I offered spousal benefits. And so cities ought to be able to say, XYZ marriage is a benefit, a marriage that is worthy of benefits, and ABC marriage over here is a marriage that does not deserve benefits. And that is just another way of trying to make us second-class citizens. So we still have to be vigilant.
Yeah, 100%. I am so many things that are echoing right now, thinking about, don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue. Pre that, we think about folks who are being kicked out of the military, and you talked about the police academy, just a lot of eerie correlations there. But something I wanted to get to was, have you, as mayor or any of your elected positions, faced challenges based on your identities? I mean, you served out both of your terms that are now banned, so that Houston liked you, but you've had some lawsuits and other stuff. So could you maybe talk to us a little bit about your personal experiences there?
So I won 9 consecutive races in the city of Houston, citywide in the city of Houston. Reelected, my 2 reelects as controller, I was unopposed, although I think that's as much about, no one really knows what the city controller does, as that I was really good at it. But I didn't win immediately. I actually had 2 races that I lost before I won the 9 races. In 1991, I was persuaded by the LGBTQ community to run to represent the community as part of a redistricting effort. And we were trying to convince the courts and the state that the LGBT community should be a community of interest and should be considered in drawing lines. Obviously, didn't happen, but I ended up staying in the race and ran against an incumbent, a moderate Democratic LGBT ally. Running against an incumbent, you have about, 3% odds of being successful. It's not great odds. I was beaten soundly by the incumbent, curled up into a fetal position for a while, and said, I'm not ever going to do this again. 4 years later, there was a special election. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who still serves since 1995, had been a council member, and she was elected to Congress, and she vacated her seat. And it was a special election, January election in 95, 6-week campaign. I mean, it was like that. And I said, I hated campaigning, but nobody needs to talk me into it this time. I'm ready to run. I'm going to do this. What I didn't take into account is that there were 19 candidates. There was only one thing on the ballot. It was Christmas and New Year's. No one cared that there was a city council race. I did not attend a single candidate function where there were more people in the audience than there were candidates. It was just a miserable experience. No one paid any attention. I finished 3rd behind someone who'd already been elected countywide as a Republican and someone who'd already been elected countywide as a Democrat. So you had 2 experienced politicians that had party backing, and they ended up in a runoff, and they duked it out. And I finished 3rd, and I said, this is crazy. And obviously, I thought, I didn't think. I knew I had a better knowledge of city government and city issues because I was the president of the largest civic association in Houston. I was, in city council meetings and in hearings and working it, and they just sort of parachuted in. And I realized that politics is not a meritocracy, and it's not fair. And if I was going to win, if I was going to actually try it again and win, I had to make some changes, because the biggest problem I had in both of those races is that every time I saw my name in print, every time I was mentioned, it was an East Parker gay activist running for city council. Because I'd been out in college, I was arguably the most visible lesbian activist in Houston in the 80s. Councilmember Lovell was arguably the other most visible lesbian activist in the 80s. And again, it's telling that she and I both were elected to city council. But as long as I was an East Parker gay activist, I couldn't talk about potholes or trash pickup or any of the things that I cared about as a civic club president. I was an East Parker gay. And so when I ran the third time, among the other things, and I had to learn how to raise money. But the most important thing I did was I created a portfolio of the TV coverage and the newspaper coverage. And there were two newspapers back then. That's kind of unusual. 2 newspapers and 3 TV stations. And I had my little VHS recorded tape of the little TV coverage there was of my 2 races. And I made appointments with the editorial staffs of the 2 newspapers and the TV stations and said, look at this. And especially when I was in the race with 18 other people, every one of my opponents, you describe, when you write about the race, you describe what they do for a living. I work for Republican oil man Robert Mosbacher. I have worked for him, at that point, I'd worked for him for 17 years. All you talk about is what I do as a volunteer. And actually, what I did as a volunteer 10 years ago, like lesbian activist. I'm actually president of a civic club association now, not an officer or board member of any LGBT organization. Why do you keep bringing this up? I'm perfectly comfortable telling people that I'm a lesbian, but it's not what I do for a living. And it's not right, it's not fair to treat me differently than the other candidates. I'd like to think that I was really persuasive, but I think more than that, the world was changing too. But the third time I ran, 1997, the coverage changed. I was no longer an East Parker gay or an East Parker lesbian. I was an East Parker oil company analyst. They would figure out a way to bring up me being a lesbian in like after the jump in the newspaper, but people don't read after the jump. And it wasn't my last name, and it gave me enough space to really talk about things. And then I raised enough money to be able to cut a TV commercial and introduce myself independently, which was extremely helpful. And we could spend a lot more time talking about the political campaign. The only other thing I'll say about that race, even though I was working really hard to become not an East Parker gay, I didn't want anybody, because I had been an activist and started out as an activist, I didn't want anybody to think I was ashamed. So every piece of literature, and I still have a complete portfolio of that campaign, every piece of literature I put out in that campaign, as you know, you flip it over, you get the bio. It said, past president, Houston Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. So the GNL words were on the literature, so that I didn't have to talk about it. No one else had to talk about it. You know, occasionally, you know, some opponent would like, if it's sort of an inoculation technique, because if I say it and, you know, suddenly they start talking about it, everybody's like, well, duh. You know, it was funny in the race, which I did win. And then again, 8 more. I was in a runoff. Mayor's race was in a runoff, and one of the other at-large council races were in a runoff. And we were out in Kingwood, which is a very conservative suburban area of Houston, at a candidate forum. And we'd been answering, my opponent and I had been answering questions, and all of a sudden some guy stood up in the audience. All 3 campaigns were there, but some guy stood up in the audience and screamed at me and said, you know, Ms. Parker, you've been sitting up there with these other folks for almost an hour talking about potholes and trash pickup and answering questions, and you have never once revealed your homosexual agenda for the city of Houston. And it was like the seas parting. It was like everybody just kind of moved away from the guy. But it was such a beautiful softball, because I just said, I'm so glad you asked that question. I've been up here talking about the things that I think are most important to the city of Houston, and that's what I'm running for. It gave me an opportunity to, you know, distinguish myself and slam home. And there's this weird sort of combination of chauvinism and chivalry that happens in the South when you attack a woman and you're rude. That I think I am confident that it picked up more votes than it cost me when he did that.
Wow, that is, oh, that would be an experience, but I'm glad
when I was mayor, people used to, mayor is a very intense job. It is 24/7, and it wore on me. I loved it. I was excited to go to work every day, but it's a very hard job because mayors don't get to pick and choose. You have to deal with everything that happens in your city.
Yeah.
And when someone asked me if I wasn't ever scared when people got mad at me, they do come, with the figurative pitchforks and tar and feathers every so often. And was ever intimidated and afraid as mayor. And when I was mayor, I had a full-time security detail. I had men and women with guns standing behind me. I made it through the 70s and 80s as an out lesbian activist. I had my tires slashed. I had death threats. There is nothing that happened in a political context that was at all as frightening as being on my own in some of those circumstances as an activist. So in that sense, being in public office was a much, much easier circumstance. Now, do I think I was treated differently because I was LGBT? Yes, it certainly came up during the campaign. But I also think I was treated differently because I'm a woman. I was the first LGBT mayor of any top 100 US city. I was only the 10th woman in American history to lead a top 10 US city. There's still a glass ceiling. I think there's maybe been, I think Ivy Taylor, I think was 11 in Dallas. Lori Lightfoot, there maybe 12, maybe 13. I stopped counting. But the interesting thing is that of the at least 13 women who've led major, top 10 US cities, and I think it's only been 13. 6 of us were Texas mayors. 2 in Houston, 2 in Dallas, 2 in San Antonio. New York, supposedly a very liberal place, has never been represented by a woman mayor. LA never had a woman mayor. Philly, same. There's something about Texas, and again, I said that sort of, chauvinism and chivalry. If you can compete, if you can go toe to toe, if you can prove that you are tough enough and smart enough and you have the chops, you can be successful in politics in Texas. People sort of that frontier attitude. We want to know what you can do, not where you're from or who your people were. And we as women politicians in Texas, I think, have benefited from that. Part of the problem is that if you don't run, you don't win, though, and women still run for office at abysmally low rates.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an amazing piece of history. I think we talk, again, a lot about LGBT experiences being very coastal, but the fact that we've had so many politicians here in Texas is amazing. And I know you've participated in the Women's Center's elector program that we unfortunately didn't get to have this past year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I thought, since we're here and it's Women's History Month, do you have any advice for women or out LGBT folks for politics? What would you tell our students or folks who are thinking about it right now?
One of the things that I enjoy about my current position at LGBTQ Victory is, and it's where Victory, if you do a Google internet search, victoryfund.org or victoryinstitute.org, where there's a PAC and a C3. We don't work with allies. We don't do policy. We are about trying to help LGBT leaders achieve office. The fund is an endorsing organization. We're primarily a bundling pack, but the Institute has a suite of services that we offer to out LGBT candidates. We offer a top-notch candidate and campaign training. If you've ever thought about wanting to run for office, you're from the LGBTQ community, you need to come to our, it's 3.5 days. Previously it was in person. Now we're still virtual, but we'll be offering 3 more trainings. We just finished one. We'll be offering 3 more trainings this year. About 45 people per training. If you're a woman wanting to run for office, there's several organizations that do a top-notch training. Emily's List, look up Emily's List, She Should Run. There are others. I think even if you haven't been around campaigns, and I've been involved in, but because of my work at the LGBTQ political caucus, I've been involved in campaigns and volunteered for other campaigns, so I was somewhat familiar with campaigns. It is different being a candidate, but for a lot of folks who've never been part of the political process, it is intimidating. So, and women like to be invited to run, and I'm guilty of this. I got talked into my first race, and then we want to know everything there is to know about the process before we jump into it. So there's great training. Victory Institute can provide you training. These other organizations can provide you great training. You could actually go to probably a QAnon training for how to run for office, and 80–90% of it wouldn't be any different from the training that we would provide, because it's about the nuts and bolts of campaigning. The piece that's different and what we offer and what the trainings for women offer is how to take your own narrative, your life experiences, and make them a part of the campaign and a part of the strength and the experiences that you offer to voters. I clearly have felt more impact as a public official, as a woman, than, as a candidate, yes, as a lesbian but once I got through the, Denise Parker lesbian candidate or Denise Parker gay candidate, that a lot of that fell away. But I am always, people see me, they relate to me, they know I'm a woman. Now, I always, because I've been out so much, and so my wife likes to say that we're not out of the closet, we live on the front lawn, because I've been out my entire adult life. I mean, I assume that people know when I interact with them that that I'm a lesbian, but I don't know that, I walk up to a stranger on the street that they would know that, but they're always going to know I'm a woman. And the barriers and limitations, the biases that adhere to women candidates were definitely there for me, and they're much more potent than really than the challenges I faced as an out lesbian.
Thank you. We usually answered some of our questions that have been coming in over Facebook Live, so appreciate you getting to them already. But one of the questions I thought it'd be fun to ask, what was the most rewarding part of being mayor?
Oh, being able to shape the future of my hometown. The fun thing, I mean, there are fun things about it. It is a very intense job. I averaged 1,300 events and meetings a year just on Mondays through Fridays. My normal schedule was, if I didn't have a breakfast meeting, my security detail would pick me up at precisely 8 a.m. every morning. If I had a breakfast, they'd pick me up early enough to go to breakfast. And my goal was to be at home at 9 o'clock every night. And just whatever we could jam in that time. Weekends were fun runs. God, I hated fun runs. Fun runs on Saturday and Sunday morning. But it's really the only exercise I got. But then you like downtime, and then there'd be something during the middle of the day, and then downtime, And then, Friday and Saturday night are gala nights. So there was always something. So it goes, 24/7. But the rewarding parts are when you can make something happen. We had a vast expansion of parks and green space while I was mayor. The Bio Greenway initiatives, the Parks by You trails, which are hike and bike trails along all the major bios that run through the city of Houston. Yay, that happened on my watch. Buffalo Bio Park was redone on my watch. I'm actually on the board of the Houston Botanic Garden, which just opened a year ago, and I helped put the deal together to decommission a city golf course so they can build the Botanic Garden on that site. So parks and green space. The other thing is I'm passionate about infrastructure. So not something that any smart politician would probably brag about, but 3 months after I was elected mayor, I went to city council and persuaded them to hike water and sewer rates 30%, because no one who preceded me had the guts to do that. And we didn't have enough money in the system to do renewal and replacement, and it was falling apart. And that same year, my first year in office, that fall, I went to the voters and asked them to impose a drainage fee on themselves, and they did. Because we made a compelling argument that why the city of Houston had to invest in streets and drainage, and those two things were the right things to do. They were good government things to do. Pay as you go, invest, and so the things that nobody sees about it aren't sexy, or nobody sees and aren't sexy, like underground sewer and water lines, and then the really fun stuff like huge changes in the park system. That's a lot of fun. Now, actually, the most fun I ever had as mayor was I discovered backhoes. I have to tell you this. You know what a backhoe is? It is the piece of construction equipment that has the big claw. Yes. You demolish things. And we had a bunch of abandoned buildings in Houston, and I created Demolition Day. It was in May. We got a bunch of private contractors to come in and use their equipment to help us demolish abandoned, houses that were, the crack houses and magnets for crime in neighborhood. Very popular neighborhood program. We did demolitions year round, but on Demolition Day, we try to take down a whole bunch of them, get a lot of publicity. So the first time we did one, I do a photo op on a backhoe, and the operator's standing next to me, and we do the picture. And then the next time I do one, and he says, "Hey, you want to operate the controls?" and shows me how, like, watching over me, shows me how to operate the controls, and the power of being able to send that claw out and rip the front of a building off. And it got to where I would, like, after about, 20 of these of various sizes over the years, I got to be like, I'm kind of cocky with this. And they would leave me alone in the cockpit. And, I wouldn't move the thing, but I would, like, move the claw around and so forth. Until the day I was out there and I was having so much fun, and I knocked the wall down on a house, and it fell the wrong way, and it landed about 2 feet away from the house next door. That was a perfectly lovely house that didn't need to be demolished. And I was like, okay, I cannot do this anymore. I know enough to be dangerous. Get me out of here before I really get the city sued. But that was actually, there's a feeling of power just to be able to, well, one, feel like you're doing something good and taking away an eyesore, but the heavy equipment, a lot of fun. Are there any other questions?
So I think we've covered most of them that we've gotten over. We covered a lot. I did not, coming into this conversation, didn't know we would be talking about Lawrence versus Texas, or some of the unsexy side of politics, like sewers. I think Demolition Day sounds like a really fun time.
One of the most important things for people to understand about politics is that political positions are not interchangeable.
Yeah.
Because Victory, my day job, I work with candidates across the country. We endorsed 390 candidates last year. And so I was working with candidates, every state, every level. So down ballot candidates, And I love the down ballot candidates, a lot of the first time candidates, and then we do the training, but we also do the endorsement. And I can't tell you how many times over the years someone's come up to me and said, I want to run for office someday. No one cares that you want to run for office. The office is a tool, it's not a destination. What do you want to do? If I would not, I'm never going to run for, I would never run for school board. It would just, I would go crazy. I don't want to know about curriculum. I'm glad other people do. That's not my passion. I served on council with people who ran for city council because they wanted to run for Congress someday. And council is about barking dogs and potholes and trash pickup and weedy lots. And can you get that abandoned building demolished? They were terrible council members because they really weren't interested. And so they were just dialing it in. So the important thing for people to understand about politics, find the thing that you are passionate about, and then find the level of politics that works on that thing. And you may or may not want to be the principal, be in office, but you absolutely have a responsibility to make sure that that level of government that does the thing that you care about functions well, does it right, does it efficiently, does it effectively, and is a good steward of your tax dollars. We all have a responsibility to do that. And then maybe you might want to run for office yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So we are at time. This is our last Pride Live of the academic year. We're so grateful to Mayor Parker for coming and talking to us about all of these different intersections and stuff. And hopefully we have sparked some interest in politics and other areas for folks. Coming up in April, we will be having our Lavender graduation on April 9th. Mayor Parker formally keynoted for us last year, so that is still available online. I highly recommend that address. It's very moving. Also the TCOM monologues, those are the coming out monologues. Those are a compelling, raw, and transformative story about the coming out experiences for folks here at Texas A&M and at the larger community. That's going to be on April 2nd. It'll be a part of LGBTQ Awareness Week, which will be coming up the first weekend in April, or the first week of April, I'm sorry. And we'll have a variety of other center programs. So if you're just looking for things like game nights, our Let's Talk program, those will all be on our social media. So thank you, folks. And we are going to be disconnecting now.